Assalamu alaikum wa marhaba. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I said it both in English and Arabic. My name is Khalid Al-Amri. I'm a resident of New York City, and I'm delighted that you are joining us today for today's symposium titled Civilian in the Conflict of Yemen, an International Humanitarian Law Perspective, sponsored by the International League for Peace and Human Rights and the International Council for Right and Freedom. We have people watching on social media, so thank you for joining us as well. Thank you. We are going to hold the question to the end. There are two sessions today. The first session will cover a welcoming remark by Dr. Dahan Najjar, and then we'll begin the event, Child Soldier, Recruitment Killing the Future. And the second section will cover the use of landmines, the hit and killing, and the use of detainees as human shields with three speakers. Child Soldiers, Recruitment Killing the Future. Today is the 355 days since the start of the civil war in Yemen. Child soldier recruitment in Yemen is an alarming phenomenon that has started to catch the attention of the international community. The speakers will analyze the motives and circumstances which are specific to the current conflict and compared to the shared experience of the international community in the field. The relevant findings and conclusions will be drawn from multiple perspectives, including the international and humanitarian norms published by reports and documents, observation from partners organization. The first speaker will be Dr. Dahan Najjar. Dr. Dahan Najjar is an academic and researcher in the international relations and foreign policy. He is the president of the International Council for Right and Freedom. He's an educational and social expert and political and human rights activist, Dr. Dahan Najjar.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, representatives of United Nations bodies, diplomatic missions, NGOs, and independent activists in the humanitarian and human rights fields, distinguished community leaders, media representatives, and all those interested in Yemeni affairs, I welcome you to this special event and greeting you with sincere humanitarian greetings. Our goal is to update you about the serious violations of the international humanitarian law during the current war in Yemen and convey to you the reality of the disastrous humanitarian situation caused by the collapse of the political consensus in the country. After the collapse of the political process of consensus, which was produced by a comprehensive national dialogue conference, March 2013, January 2014, Yemen has been in a state of devastating war that led to the destruction of infrastructures, the collapse of health system, educational process, and national economy. The coup against the political process in 2014 in the beginning of internal and external war led to economic and social collapse and to increased rates of poverty and the spread of famine and chronic diseases in the entire Yemeni region. According to the reports of the United Nations, in this specialized agencies reports of the national and international humanitarian relief and human rights organizations working on the ground. The ongoing war in Yemen has left the world's biggest and worst humanitarian crisis and disaster at current time. It is the most destructive war in the modern and contemporary history of the country. The current war in Yemen has led to the greatest violations of the international humanitarian law, protecting civilians during wars and armed conflicts. In addition to the negative consequences of the war on economy, health, education, infrastructure, social service, and social security operations, there are a number of serious direct violations of the international humanitarian law targeting civilians, especially against children, such as the children recruitment and pushing them to the front line of the military confrontation. The use of civilians as human shields, bombing civilians' neighborhood, worship places, schools, hospitals, destruction of historical and cultural monuments, and planting various kinds of landmines in agricultural fields, public roads, buildings, and civilians populated areas and neighborhoods. The consequences of the disastrous war in Yemen cannot be limited to the full and precise responsibility of the parties to maintain civilian rights in accordance with the international humanitarian law, which guarantees their protection during war, but requires the international community to take actions to force them to fulfill their responsibilities, such as accurate monitoring of violations by the parties in the war in a neutral and transparent manner through professional monitoring teams on the ground, directly and indirectly, and warning the violating party that if they continue violating international humanitarian law, they will be held responsible for their actions and cannot escape punishment in the future. Yemen needs restore peace to it by imposing peaceful and just solutions. The rules of international humanitarian law cannot be respected in Yemen without respect for its constitutional laws. In order to help Yemen overcome the effect of the war, the international community, represented by the United Nations, should offer after-war immediate help in 1. Cleaning the ground from landmines and explosive objects of all categories. 2. The international community should prepare rehabilitation comprehensive programs and plans for Yemen and Yemeni people. Rehabilitation for state and society institutions, educational systems, national economy and infrastructure, and long-term physical and psychological health. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Dahan. Very informative introductory. Our second speaker will be Peter Selberry. Peter will cover child soldiers, and protecting civilians under international norms. Peter is a senior consultant fellow, Middle East and North Africa program, Chatham House, UK, United Nations, worked as a journalist and analyst focused on political economy issues in the MENA region since 2008. He has worked as a consultant to the United Kingdom Government Department for International Development, the United Nations, and the World Bank. Mr. Peter Salisbury.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. First, a confession and an apology. My primary expertise is not in IHL. It's not in international humanitarian law, and I thought that the most useful thing I could do to start us off this morning was, as briefly as possible, to try and set the scene a little and talk a little bit about the issue of the use of child soldiers and about what life is like during this conflict for civilians. As you'll probably notice, I'm not Yemeni, so I apologize if I seem to be trying to speak for anybody, but I do have a slight advantage over some of the people who are working on Yemen in that I was based in Yemen in 2013 and 2014. I've been working in and on the country since 2008, and I've returned to Yemen 4 times since the civil war began. I traveled extensively in the north at the end of 2015. I spent quite a lot of time in the south in 2016, and most recently, about a month and a half ago, I had the opportunity to travel along the front lines in Hodeidah. So putting things together piecemeal, I can draw you a little bit of a picture of what things look like on the ground, particularly from the perspective of this question of the use of child soldiers and the protection of civilians, and I'll leave others to speak about what this means under international humanitarian law. As a little bit of background, it's important to note that even before this conflict began, the question of the use of child soldiers in Yemen was one that had been the subject of a great deal of focus for different international players. During the transition period of 2012 to 2014, parts of the UN worked on programs with the military as part of the overall restructure of the security and military services on this question of the use of child soldiers, the recruitment of people of 13, 14, 15 years old into the national military. A sub-issue there was the widespread presence of what we might call armed groups, but in Yemen, given that, we see this ridiculous figure of 60 million AK-47s for a country of 28 million people, but anyone who spent a lot of time in Yemen, especially outside of the big cities before the war, will know that the presence of guns was a constant, and that a number of tribal groups were the main governance and security actor at a local level, and many of them had security stations, checkpoints, whatever you want to call them, in the areas that they controlled, and often it was not uncommon at all to see people who were quite clearly below the age of 16 manning these checkpoints. And I have a quite specific memory of traveling to Sada, which was then under the control of the Houthis in 2014, the beginning of the year, before the Houthis made their way down through Amran and into Sana'a on a number of occasions, seeing young men with guns at checkpoints as young as 11 or 12. And under international law, given that there was combat in the area, given that they were affiliated with an armed groups, these would be considered child soldiers. Similarly, when one traveled through Amran, Al-Jawf and Marib as well, you would see a similar picture. You would see these checkpoints in areas with incredibly young boys with guns. And often we'd hear the same story wherever we traveled, which was, oh, his father must have gone away and left him to watch the checkpoint for a short while. But once you see this picture enough times, the picture builds up. Similarly, traveling to military bases even before the conflict, not uncommon to see very young boys in uniforms. And in many cases, this was the only form of employment available to families, or the family was a military family, and it was simply seen as natural for the child to do this. Or if you came from a tribal system, it was simply normal to put a young man on a checkpoint, but put him in harm's way at one and the same time, particularly in areas of active conflict. So we have to understand that the underlying norms in Yemen, although there were a number of highly engaged attempts to change them, actually facilitated the use of young men, at the very least for some form of security, if not in frontline conflict. And when we begin the war, what we see is that particularly in areas like Taiz and Aden, there isn't the force fighting against the Houthis as they filter out across the country, Marib as well. These are not professionalized fighting forces. I was in Aden in early 2016 and was able to meet a number of the groups operating on the ground. This wasn't a national army. This was a collection of resistance groups and pre-existing militias, particularly in the case of some of the Salafi groups that operate across the south and in Taiz and now across Hodeidah. So again, sort of their adherence to international norms, not likely to be particularly strong to start with. And again, Aden in 2016, very common to see young men with guns on checkpoints, and very common to hear stories of people as young as 14, 15 killed during the fighting. And this is a constant theme of armed conflicts across the world. Similarly, the Houthis, as we all know, when they eventually pulled out of Aden in June, July 2015, left behind a number of confused young men. There's these famous stories of some of the soldiers taken prisoner at the end of that round of fighting, 14, 15, 16 years old, being told that they were put in a car and told that they were going to Ib to guard checkpoints, and were sent to the front lines in Aden as part of an attempt to force project. And part of the issue here with the Houthis is that this is an organization which has a relatively small core of highly skilled and trained fighters who traditionally have used a process of quote-unquote blooding in, which is sending people to the front lines and seeing how they do. This isn't a long-term training process for the group. And increasingly, since the war has begun, obviously that initial core of fighters has been depleted. And what we've seen is the group at first recruiting and now increasingly press ganging, forcing people to join the conflict, to the extent that among some of the tribes, the so-called colored tribes around Sana'a, this has become a real source of tension. People being forcibly recruited from schools and other events. But the use of child soldiers is clearly not limited to the Houthis, although they may be the worst offender. As I said, at the end of September into early October, I had the opportunity to travel up into Hodeidah and to see some of the groups fighting on the front lines. In particular, I was able to spend time on the ground with Amalika, with the Giants Brigade, with the Tahama Resistance, and with some of the presidential forces. I wasn't able to penetrate the forces being led by Tariq Saleh, the so-called Guards of the Republic, or Republican Guards. And again, a constant theme was seeing incredibly young men, some of whom would quite openly say that they were 15 years old, 16 years old, so within the range to be defined as child soldiers, and some of whom in one particular case very cheerfully told us after thinking that he was 18 but that he had been fighting on and off since 2011 and had been fighting throughout the conflict. So even if we take the fact that he is 18, the fact is that he has been fighting on the ground since, according to him, the age of 11 years old, which is deeply, deeply disturbing. And again, recruitment in this process, particularly with the groups like Amalika, are based on the use of local communities to bring people in and religious networks to bring people in. So we have two sort of networks centered around the Yafa area in the south of Yemen, and Radfan to a lesser extent, really feeding most of the forces into Amalika. And at one and the same time, Salafi groups based loosely around networks that originated in Dar al-Hadith in the north of the country, in Sada, feeding in as well. So recruiting through religious groups, through mosques and religious leaders, and then through local communities. And again, as the bench becomes thinner, as the number of people that can be sent in and as the economic circumstances in Yemen become more and more constrained, people sending younger and younger men to the front lines, not always in direct frontline fighting roles, and again this issue of checkpoints manned by young men. And the issue really goes on and on, and as long as this conflict lasts, as long as it pervades, and as long as there is really no accountability for the actions of any of the groups involved in the conflict, it's very difficult to see this trend from being abated. And again, this isn't just a Yemeni experience. This is something that is a common theme that we see across many, many conflicts worldwide, and particularly conflicts that involve a large number of irregular forces and multiple irregular forces based on community identity, so on, so forth, rather than large professionalized forces. And I would make the argument that accountability really, as the opening speaker said, is the core issue here. There are international laws. The UN has a mandate to report on the violation of international norms and laws. And throughout the conflict, all parties, some more egregiously so in different forms to the conflict, have violated these laws in different ways. I would like to think that the talks ongoing in Sweden right now will help to lead us towards an end game. I think the best phrase is to think with hope and plan for the worst. And I've said this a number of times over the last few days, and I'm sorry for butchering that phrase as well. But realistically, as the conflict continues, these issues will get worse unless we find some sort of mechanism for holding people to account. And once the war has ended, there is a real likelihood that new conflict will break out in Yemen. And again, accountability will be a core issue. That's me on, I think, about 11 minutes. I'll wrap up my presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Apparently what I got out of this is that child soldier is very well documented, and we need to hold those accountable, those involved, because this is a crime not only against children, but against the future of Yemen. The next speaker is Dr. Muhammad Al-Azzani. He'll be covering killing the future child soldier in Yemen. Dr. Muhammad is an academic, politician, and human rights advocate. He's the president of Tamdan Foundation in the United Kingdom. He's also a consultant in management development for small and medium enterprises. Dr. Mahmoud Al-Azzani. I apologize for mispronouncing your name.
Good morning. Can you hear me all? First, I do apologize for the tenacious start this morning and a bit belated start as well. We are not, this is the first event we have in the headquarters of the UN. So always the first experience comes up with its own excitements, but it comes up with its own hiccups as well. So please share the excitement, although the subject is not that exciting as well. But do excuse us for any hiccups in today's start. Talking about the subject, child soldiers in Yemen, it's one of the most important issues that needs to be looked at. Not because of its tremendous effect during this war, not because of the level of victimhood that's in the ground, but because as well it's going to affect the future generation. It's going to affect how Yemen will look like in the near and far future. Today's generation, instead of being at schools, instead of following a bright future, like any children around the world, they are being sent to front lines. They are being killed. They have been taken out of schools. The consequences for Yemen, it's going to go for generations. And those consequences will be very devastating and very painful. First of all, this presentation, it will try to shed the light on the phenomenon based on several sources. First, it's based on Child Recruitment in Yemen report produced by the Yemeni Coalition for Reporting Human Rights Violations in Yemen. And second, it's going to produce some findings from the UN and international organizations' reports, at least to bring a kind of comparative perspective into the findings and figures. Finally, any documented pictures and videos, at least to bring some life into the issue. Time frame that we will cover in terms of the report by the Rust Foundation, Rust. It covers the issue right from the 2014 when the conflict broke up until July 2018. And it will cover about 18 provinces in Yemen where these incidents being recorded and documented. And it will address all responsible parties regardless. It will talk about the responsibility of government forces, semi-government forces, and Houthis as well, Al-Qaeda, and whoever on the ground. Of course, this report, I mean, when I refer to the report, I mean I refer to the report produced by Rust Coalition in particular. It has 27 field monitors and researchers in 22 provinces around Yemen. They've been trained to the international standard, and they produce their findings based on field work, mainly meetings with families, looking at the hospital records, and actually they look at those wall announcement of child victims and celebrations sometimes. I mean, surprisingly, this phenomena has as well a celebrating side, because actually part of the glorification, they celebrate and produce a lot of pictures around the walls, and you can record them just outside there. It's not very difficult to be detected. And of course, meeting with the individuals and families who are subject to this. We have as well secondary data. I relied mainly with the UN representative for child soldier recruitment and compared it with the Yemeni report. Let's start by looking at the definition. I'm not going to read it because most of you are familiar with it. It's just a reminder. So we just keep to the legal framework that how do we define the child soldiers. And actually Yemen, it's one of those countries it's one of 8 countries of concern that's been recorded for the United Nations. Unlike other countries, Yemen in May, the Yemeni government signed an action plan with the UN to address this issue. But of course, at that time, we started the conflict and we witnessed the collapse of state. So the other things is the Yemeni have in 2002 they have issued a law which protect children from recruitment, and the Article 149 of the Yemeni Children Rights Law is prohibiting the recruitment of child soldiers, which is in the positive side. But actually, following the collapse of state in 2014 and the breakup of conflict, the observations to these commitments are not seen up to yet, as we're going to see very soon. Looking at the issue from a wider perspective, from the international experience, child soldier recruitment, it's not a new phenomena in Yemen, but it's been observed throughout many countries as well. And it has a kind of common factors between countries. The push factor, which is mainly related to the motives of those who recruit, they look at it as economically efficient because they don't pay formal salaries like what they're going to pay for the formal armies. Sometimes with a very dire economic situation, children could be recruited just for the daily maintenance or food. And the other issue is children are easy to indoctrinate. We've seen, particularly with the religious group mainly, they develop very motivating scenes for children to be recruiting, mainly by pushing them towards the issue of heroism and like I just borrow one of their phrases, for example, Khalifat groups, which is mainly Al-Qaeda and Daesh, they call them the cubs of Khalifats. While Houthis, they call them the cubs of the cubs of Wilayat, actually, or of the Quranic mission. So that plays a very significant role in Yemen, but children are usually easy to indoctrinate. Children usually didn't develop the concept, they haven't had any developed concept of death. So sometimes they're going to be taken by just without realizing the consequences for their own future. The pull factor which is related to the children themselves is poverty. Poverty is the main factor that brings children into this subject. And sometimes around many countries, discrimination is another factor, particularly when they find to identify themselves within and reinforce their own present if they are subject to any kind of discrimination. And the culture of martyrdom is not only exclusive to Yemen, but it's there in other international experiences as well. The consequences are, as mentioned here before, physical consequences. They come with death, injuries. Death, it's loss for families. Injuries, it's suffering for the future for a long time. It comes with functional disabilities. A lot of them, they need rehabilitation. Some of them, they come up with permanent disabilities for the rest of their life. Emotional deficit, we've seen experiences and we've heard this for those who come back from fronts. I mean, they come back, they could get in a state of chronic depression or get engaged in violent practices even after they come out of the front lines. Family and community breakdowns. We have the most serious things in Yemen in particular is the revenge. Particularly those who get involved in this conflict, they live a lot of sense of revenge, whether it's tribal, family, or regional, or whatever you call it. And of course, social and economic life, because actually we're going to have a whole generation which will not have the right education for the future, and particularly they're not ready to take jobs that they're going to be available at this time. In terms of the particular case of Yemen, this phenomenon hasn't been studied enough. We've only started to observe some kind of initial studies into the issue, but the findings, they confirm the main assumptions. For example, if you look at this figure, you're going to see the economic factor is the main one. This is based on an interview that's been conducted with about 200 children who've been released from front lines. And when they ask them, 70% reported they just been recruited because of the economic factors. And the coercive here, it's about 5%. Family breakdown, for example, they don't have anybody to take care of them, it's 5%. Tribal values, of course, we know people, the tribal leaders, they are actually at this particular time, they are the main source, as Peter mentioned earlier. The two channels, it's come through tribal and religious leaders. I would say that five of them come through the tribal and 15 come through the religious indoctrination channels. And again, if you look at the issue of the glorification of death is the main theme for the phenomenon itself. And it's about to be, it's one of the stories, I couldn't believe it myself, that, for example, me as a parent, I would, at any circumstances, feel needing to celebrate the death of my child. But unfortunately, if you want to see the deepest sense of trouble, is we reach the point where some parents, they celebrate the death of their children, and they shoot fires into the air, shout slogans, and do everything. How come? Who managed to convince these people to act against their human instinct? It's the religious indoctrination mainly. It's the culture of martyrdom. It's the glorification of death. Instead of being inspired for the future life, people are inspired to die. Maybe some people, they might find that the existing circumstances of life in Yemen, it's not appealing. Maybe that's another factor as well. It could be linked to the first factor. So they find themselves stubborn. Instead of grieving, they celebrate. But that will leave a very serious consequences for the future. If you look at the graphical distribution in terms of the geographical areas, mainly child soldier recruitments mostly around three main regions, which is Sana, Amran, Damar, and Saada. This explains itself with other figures who shows who is more responsible in terms of recruiting. You can see this in the report. Actually, the report, if you want to see this report in more details, you can leave your name and email address, and I will email it to you immediately. There is more details, but the limitations of times that we have here doesn't allow me to go in more details into this. So I will just try to give you just the feeling of it, and if you want to read thoroughly into it, you are more than welcome. You just leave your email and name, and I will email it to you immediately. Looking at some statistics as well, there is two statistics which I draw my findings from. This report, it's recorded about more than 6,000 child recruitment starting from 2014 until July 2018. Out of those, 72% were recruited by Houthis, 15% recruited by pro-government forces, and 9% by Al-Qaeda. The other report, this is actually the UN. This is the UN report, I'm sorry. It's 842 verified cases for the 2017. And according to this report, which is presented to the UN General Secretary, 72% are from Houthis, pro-government 15%, Al-Qaeda about 9%. Our report, which is the one that we have in our hands, it shows a little bit different statistics. They claim that Houthis recruited 90% of child soldiers, the pro-government 3%, and Al-Qaeda 1%. The discrepancy between the two reports could be explained in different terms. Mainly, actually, because of the definition or age, the difficulty of identifying the age. And if the majority of those children are in these 3-4 provinces, we know that public record doesn't exist to verify the age unless you talk to the children themselves or their families. The other thing is the access. Those who have access to the areas controlled by Houthis don't have access to the areas controlled by the government forces, and the vice versa. And the second, I can't exclude the possibility of a kind of bias as well, because we're not very sure about everybody's work on field or their circumstances. Again, out of the 842 recruited by Houthis. They've been monitoring what happened to them, actually, the consequences. 268 were killed, 58 injured, 122 captive, and 454 still fighting in their forces up to now. To give a kind of feel of it, I'm not sure about this video, if it's going to work, but it gives very good illustration about the indoctrination that happens to them. بين الصوت ارفع الصوت عندك.
شرحوا اليوم يتدربوا وكانت التداريب عالية جدا وإن شاء الله هؤلاء هم سيقاتلون أمريكا وإسرائيل وهم من سيأخذون قمار القتال وسيقاتلون في سبيل الله لأنهم يتحركون من الآن وما زالوا جيلا ينشأ لمقاتلة أعداء الله وشكرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر.
Finally, I would like to thank everybody, and again, this picture is very special to me because it shows the differences between the way to killing the future and the way to building the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Is this the last video? That's the video he's talking about? Since Peter will be leaving, I think we'll move into the Q&A session for the first panel. Apparently, it seems to be that economic is a big reason that child soldier is happening in Yemen. And according to the UN, next year is the biggest challenge for the UN will be Yemen. So I'm under the assumption that child soldier will get worse. But now let's move into the Q&A session, and feel free to ask the panel's questions.
Hello, I'm Eleanor Bennett. I'm with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I was wondering if there is any kind of gender breakdown as to the child soldiers, if there are also female child soldiers. That's been an issue in other countries. I was wondering if that's one in Yemen, and if it isn't currently, if there was any evidence that it might become one. Thank you.
You're the man with statistics, I think.
Yeah, I think for Yemen in particular, it's mainly male recruitment in terms of child soldiers. Although with the definition, it doesn't exclude, it's not, the phenomena is not only about recruiting to the front lines or recruiting them as a soldiers. It's about using children for the war purposes. In Yemen, the observation have been focused only to recruitment to front lines, to soldiers. And that was only main dominant. Not just male dominant, men only recruitment, male.
Although we should probably mention that sort of a big issue that the UN's trying to deal with and others are trying to deal with as a consequence of the conflict of similar economic drivers that we see driving boys into frontline conflict is the issue of child marriage. So we're seeing higher and higher number of young girls being married off to reduce the burden on families and to make sure that they have a sort of an economic future, but often removing them from school and sending them to work and much worse in households.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Just generally for the panel, are you aware of any demobilization programs or reintegration programs that are currently underway to address the issue, just in terms of possible ongoing solutions out there?
I've had a number of conversations with some of the regional players involved in the conflict, with members of the government of Yemen, and to a lesser extent, although I have had these conversations with sort of members of the Houthi movement. I think that the one thing that's clear across the security piece for any question, be it sort of what do you do with the many, what are really militias in Yemen at this point across the board, there is no real serious planning for demobilization, disarmament, for security sector reform anywhere in Yemen. And sure, people may say we are working on a plan, but as you know, that's very different from having sort of something seriously in place, and that applies equally to the issue of child soldiers as it does any other aspect.
Any more questions?
I am Mujalli Al-Muradi. I would like to thank you so much about the good explanation about, especially about the kids who are going in that war and they become a victim. And my question, do you think you are going to put some individual names on blacklist? Because when you say organization like Houthis or Salafis or Qaeda or whoever, it's not enough. They feel it's okay, it's general. But they may get afraid if you are going to put the individual names on a blacklist. This is my question. Thanks.
I do agree with you. It's not enough now to mention general, to address this issue in general. We have to be specific. And I think one of the recommendations that came into the introductory speech from Dr. Dahan was exactly about this. Unless we start putting individual names for those responsible of this kind of violations, it's not going to stop. And I think if we start from this point, we could have some influence on the ground. I need to just mention something. There is some positive signs, because actually related to the first question. There is a rehabilitation centers I heard about, and I met some of its workers in Geneva. This rehabilitation center in Marib, it received a lot of children who came from the front lines, and they've been captured in a fighting condition, and they put them into a rehabilitation program. But I heard only about one program, and I don't think one program would be enough due to the scale of the phenomenon itself. So in my view, there is two lines to work with. The first one is to apply pressure to stop this from happening, and the pressure is not going to work unless we start putting names and referring those names to the international justice. The second point is to intensify the effort to put on the ground provisions for rehabilitation. But in order to have a wider outcome, the economic situation needs to be addressed. And I hope what's going on in Stockholm today and tomorrow and in the coming week, if it's come up with at least the minimum, which is lifting the blockade on Taiz, Hodeidah, Sana'a airport, those should go back to work, all of them. That's for the benefit of Yemeni citizens. Salaries need to be paid into all workers. We have 1 million government employees haven't been paid their salaries for about 2 or 3 years. And that's another cause for poverty, and that's another cause to push children towards this phenomena. And I think the payment of salaries of government employers will reduce at least the push factor, the pull factor a lot. And we hope that's going to happen within the recent peace talks in Geneva.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. A question to Samar Nasser.
So I have a quick question. Based on experience, I have one of my first cousins, my uncle's son, who was kidnapped in Sana'a and was attempted to be recruited. And so a lot of the cases when it comes to child recruitment, and thankfully he was freed because he didn't fit the requirements of height and all of that. But a lot of this has to do with kidnapping too, and I think that that needs to be discussed. Right, economic situation is deteriorating, but also forced kidnappings plays a huge part to this by Houthis. So is there a way maybe you guys can elaborate? Because a lot of them, and I've met child soldiers, beautiful kids, gorgeous kids, but they, when you ask them, go back, they say, we can't, we're going to get killed. So if you guys can elaborate just lightly about that.
Dr. Dahan, why don't you answer that question?
See, this is a whole process that should be treated, not only to take separate elements of it for treatment. We think that's why we call the international community to intervene in this situation, so that can prepare a complex of a package of treatment for all of these aspects in the children area. So it cannot be targeted one piece without targeting the other component of this phenomenon.
Okay, we concluded the first session. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter, you want to...
Sure, yeah, I was just going to say this is becoming an increasingly pressing issue, particularly in the north of the country. We're hearing a lot of stories like this, and not just a question of direct kidnapping. There's also this issue of young boys really being picked up by security services in Houthi-controlled territories on the basis of alleged infractions, vandalism, so on and so forth, placed in prison. And the family, in effect, being given a choice of paying rather large sums to have them released, or the child being sent into training, which is deeply disturbing. And some of the stories coming out of Hodeidah when young men are captured is one of being press ganged and sometimes taken in effect from schools. So it's a deeply disturbing trend. And coming back to this accountability piece, naming names, I think it would be a good step in the right direction to have good analysis and good research into exactly how that system works and have published analysis out there on it, perhaps through the UN panel of experts, and for people to make it clear how they intend to impose accountability in the future.
Thank you. If you have a further question, you could ask after the event. Now that conclude the first session, let's wait after. I'm sorry, again.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the organizers to organize this event. It's not a question, it's just a quick comment. My name is Marwan Dumhani. I'm the DBR of Yemen Mission here to the UN in New York. I just wanted to mention that the child recruitment is a big concern for the Yemeni government. That's why, as elaborated by Dr. Mahmoud Al-Azani, in 2014 the government signed with the UN a plan of action to eliminate the recruiting the child from the rank of the armed forces. Unfortunately, due to the conflict since 2014, we couldn't implement this plan of action. But the good news that we are in close cooperation and coordination with the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflicts to update this plan, because we believe it is a little bit outdated, taking into consideration the new developments and dynamics now in the conflict in Yemen. So we have a team now on the ground, from the Yemeni government in Aden, and the United Nations office in Aden as well, working on updating this plan and to be presented very soon and then implemented. The other issue is that we also in the government, the deputy commander of the armed forces instructed all units of the army to stop any recruitment of children under the age of 18. So we have this also goes in parallel until the plan action is updated and then implemented. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hopefully, unfortunately, we don't have anybody from the Houthi to comment on why recruitment is so high in the region. But we're going over time. Let's complete this session, and hopefully in 5 minutes we'll start the second section because I need the second section folks to come up. Thank you.
Defending the terms of human shield, which is a military and political term describing the deliberate placement of non-combatant, either military or civilian, against their will in or around military target, in order to deter the attack against these targets. The military target can be any populated sites, as a school, hospitals, market, towns, that have been used as a military sites. Such a tactic is considered a war crime by the nation that are parties to the 1949 Geneva Convention and the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention. The report can be divided into three main parts. The first part shows different statistics and figures of reports and documented cases, and the second part shows details of the report incidents and some of the horrific stories of the victim and their families. The third part of the report contains findings and recommendations to all the conflict parties. Due to the lack of time, I won't be able to go through all of them, so I will be talking briefly just to give an insight into the content of the report. This is the table. It shows, if you can just go to the next slide. Yeah. Starting with this table showing the total number of reported cases of detainees used as a human shield in 22 detention centers that have been bombed by airstrike starting since the war started until the year 2017. As you can see, the total number in the bottom is 1,202 victims, which is 77 of them were reported to be killed, 257 was wounded, and 71 still missing. The chart next to that, it's almost the same figures, just it is in percentage term, including those who survived incidents. As you can see, 7% have been killed, 20% were injured in these incidents. The next slide, please. In this report, you can see we could show other details of figure and statistics, including distribution of victims according to their professional and the differences and the different type of detention building used. As you can see, almost half of the victims were activists or politicians, where 15% are military personnel and 11% doctor, university lecturer, and students, with 1% significant of children, which counted 6 children was presented in this table. One of them was killed in the incident of Haran in north of Damar. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the report lists several stories and incidents details. I will argue you to have a look at that report. So would you please, if you're interested, to sign in your name, and Dr. Al-Azani will email you the report with the details on it. Because they really reflect the harsh reality and the atrocities of the war in Yemen. I will only present briefly 3 incidents just to highlight the issue from different perspectives and responsibilities. The first case is the Zaydiya security building in Hodeidah, which was bombed by airstrike on October 2016, leaving 30 detainees dead and 49 injured, and 32 reported to be missing. In their own report, Houthis and their allies have admitted that they have used the building as a command center, but confirmed that none of their commander has been killed in that incident. The coalition also admitted the incident and bombing the building because Houthi using it as a military command center. However, it's believed that incident could have been avoided but because of the location and being part of the security compound has been used in the past as an official prison. The second case, I will speak about the incident of Haran Mount Park in Damar, north of Damar, which was one of the earliest incidents in the conflict. The site includes several government buildings and public park, which was used as a military compound by Houthis, with 47 detainees, most of them politicians and journalists. 12 were killed, 29 were injured, 6 missing, and that's of course after bombing the site by airstrikes. One of those who was killed in this incident was Amin al-Rajawi, which we have his picture here, the head of political division in Islah Party in Ib. Amin was arrested in Ib in April 2015 by Houthis. He transferred to Haran site almost 1 month before an incident happened. My colleague, Dr. Damaj, wrote personal statement about Amin. He said, I must say that despite our political differences, Amin was one of the most respected politicians in the city of Ib. He was well known as a peace advocate with a strong opinion against violence and permanent supporter of the dialogue and peaceful transition of power in Yemen. Actually, of those who knew him, it was hard to believe that he could be arrested by anyone and for whatever reason not to be killed or used as a human shield. The third case, I would like to highlight the detention of Muhammad Ahmad al-Hakri, who was one of the detainees also in Haran Mount also. After the airstrike, his family received what was claimed to be part of his dead body. 1 week later, they received a call from him. He said he is not dead, but he tried to escape after the airstrikes, and the Houthis captured him, beat him, transferred him to another prison, and he successfully got to use the phone through smuggling the phone through some detainees in the prison. And this is his story. Reaching to the third part of the report, starting with the listing of most important findings, the report found that the use of human shield has been systematic tactic by Houthis and remains so until today. Other violation has been committed, including execution, torture of survival. Due to lack of documentation, missing victims are believed by their family to be potentially dead. The report make a couple of recommendations. They send the first recommendation to the Houthis, asking them to seize all acts of illegal detention and release all detainees, close all the secret and inappropriate detention centers, undertake the moral and legal responsibility of protecting and safety of detainees in accordance with the international law. The second recommendation was given to the Yemeni government, asking them to avoid targeting sites where civilians are expected to have been used as a human shield, open an urgent and transparent investigation into all incidents, take the moral responsibility to provide victims and their family with justice and appropriate compensation. The third recommendation was given to the Arab Coalition, the report asking them to carefully verify potential targets which are expected to be used as a human shield detention centers, even if they were military sites, investigate all reported incidents, respect all war-related international conventions and treaties. The fourth recommendation, which is finally, it's to the local and the international organization to take a responsibility in addressing the issue of using people as a human shield in Yemen more seriously, exercise more pressure on the conflict parties with more emphasis on the Houthis to ensure their compliance with the international law to protect civilians during this war. And thank you. I'm sorry for the rushing in giving the information. I was just trying to catch up with my time.
Thank you, Dr. Adel. Thank you, Dr. Adel. Apparently, the use of detainees as human shield is well documented, and crime against humanity should be implemented. We need names. We gotta hold those responsible and accountable for what they did. we're moving on to our second speaker, Samar Nasser. She's going to talk about landmines and the international law. Samar Nasser is a speaker and a commentator on Yemen affairs and the chairperson of Yemen Aid. Additionally, she's an immigration paralegal. She currently holds a BA in sociology and is pursuing her Master of Public Administration and Policy. Samar holds multiple awards from international organization and local U.S. official. Samar Nasser.
Thank you, Khalid. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first thank the International League for Peace and Human Rights, and also the International Council for Rights and Freedom for putting forth the discussion of landmines that is affecting the world today. Landmines, a silent killer, has been ruining the lives of hundreds and thousands of people since the creation of the explosives for centuries. Used in wars and local conflicts, this weapon does not know the difference between military and civilians. The explosives have seemed to be forgotten despite its deadly impact in countries amongst the poorest and underprivileged people around the world. Over 100 million landmines have been dispersed over the course of centuries, triggering explosions with one touch or simple pressure by a child or a vehicle. Access to landmines have been simple due to their inexpensive value, but also due to lawlessness and lack of governance within regions. Countries like Iraq, Somalia, and Afghanistan face indiscriminate dangers of such silent killers. But more recently, Yemen is facing a landmine crisis since the ongoing war originated by Houthis in their coup against the state and the people in 2014. CARE reports that every 15 minutes, an individual dies from a landmine explosion. Since the mid and late 1900s, Yemen used mines for military purposes and sometimes to fend off enemies. However, since the 2014 Houthi coup against the state, Houthis have used landmines at an alarming high rate than ever before. Houthis planted landmines across neighborhoods, cities, and coastal areas where fighting took place. Additionally, Houthis use tactics of planting landmines when they are near a military defeat by pro-government forces on the ground. Examples of such actions are during the conflict to free Aden and Lahej. In many cases, anti-mining personnel were organized to deactivate these explosives. The situation is so horrendous that the average Yemeni who does not know or have any proper training to deactivate the explosives risk their lives every day to protect civilians from the silent killer. There have been reports by the conflict and armament research of Houthis manufacturing their own landmines in Houthi territories, specifically in the north of Yemen. Yemen's Executive Mine Action Center has found and destroyed over 70,000 mines between 2015 and 2017. But under the pretext of national laws and treaties, there are multiple landmine ban conventions signed and participated by over 100 countries. The 1997 Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, also known as the Ottawa Treaty, was signed by 167 countries, which in turn must destroy landmine stockpiles within 4 years of the effective date of the treaty, which was on the 1st of March 1999. And within 10 years, all landmines that were implanted in the ground must be destroyed as well. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, Amendment 2, which is essentially to adopt stricter regulations on the use of landmines by signed parties from the first Ottawa Treaty. At the time, in the late 1900s, that law was very much an important milestone for international humanitarian law and human rights law perspective. But however, it wasn't enough, and it still isn't enough. Landmines are technically indiscriminate killers, which is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. However, not every country has signed to participate and abide by the Mine Ban Convention. Victims of landmines are the sole triggers of this weapon, creating a high risk of death or injury to themselves. And let's be honest, countries with the most landmine explosions are regions that lack proper healthcare systems, are relatively economically poor, and lack proper basic necessities. For humanitarian organizations specifically in Yemen, landmines have become a challenge for implementation of relief and aid assistance. The explosives effectively slow down projects due to safety risk of beneficiaries and also staff. Landmines have also prevented the growth of economic stability. Landowners, farmers, and among other local workers have been affected by the use of landmines by preventing them from using their property and their lands due to risks of their explosions. As a result, this can have a negative impact on communities that depend on local resources. We are in the 21st century, and yet we're still discussing this, and that's a problem. It is not only unfortunate, but it's also very tragic. Landmines create instability, insecurity, and local regional conflict. The United Nations must continue to promote the mine ban and to push for the respect of international law. Additionally, the international community must provide universal adherence to the norms of the treaty of the ban itself. On my own end, we would like to see more accountability and condemning by the United Nations on Houthi actions regarding mines so that Yemen's future can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Samar. The Yemeni government have documented hundreds of thousands of landmines that were discovered and neutralized. The next speaker will talk about mines and EIDs employed by Houthi forces on Yemen west coast. Jonah Leff is the Director of Operation at the Conflict Armament Research, a UK-based organization that track and map illicit weapons, ammunition, and improvised explosive devices in conflict. He has more than a decade of experience in the field of arms, controlled and armed violence. Mr. Jonah Leff.
Thank you very much, and thank you to ILPHR and ICRF for offering me the opportunity to speak here today. It's a great honor. Like Peter Salisbury, I am not an IHL expert, nor by any means would I consider myself a Yemen expert. As noted, I have a background in arms control and weapons proliferation. I'm going to speak briefly about a report that we published in September, actually that Samar noted in her presentation, so thank you for the nod, and on landmines and IEDs in Yemen. Before going into that, just quickly, I wanted to just introduce who we are and what we do to help you to contextualize what I'll be discussing in a moment. Conflict Armament Research, we were established in 2011. We're working in just over 25 countries, and we're mandated by the European Union to trace illicit weapons in conflicts. Next slide. Our mission is to generate unique evidence on weapon supplies into armed conflicts to inform and support effective weapon management and control. How do we do this? We deploy small teams of field investigators to conflicts to work side by side with defense and law enforcement agencies, typically to get access to weapons and military material that are captured during conflict. We analyze that material in order for policymakers and programmers to design informed policies to stem the issue. Next slide. Our methodology is really twofold. First off, we document weapons and their specific markings, and we send letters of request to manufacturing companies and countries to find out the supply chain of those weapons. Next. We also have a database called iTrace, which is a mapping database. All of our data goes up on that, which enables you to look at the types of weapons, the actors involved in the supply of those weapons across various regions and conflict theaters. Next slide. To date, we have over 500,000 entries on iTrace, stemming from 450 or so manufacturers in 60 countries. And this represents over 11,000 cases of diversion of weapons that we've identified in 23 conflict-affected countries. Next slide. So Yemen. We've been operating in Yemen since 2016. To date, we've deployed 10 field missions to primarily the west coast and southern coast of Yemen, embedding with coalition forces. We've documented weapons that have been captured not only from the Houthis, which will be the main focus of my presentation, but also from AQAP, as well as the Islamic State. To date, we've published 5 reports. Next slide. So the report that I'm going to briefly detail in this presentation was published in September 2018. The main findings of it are as follows. There is widespread use of mines and IEDs across western Yemen. As some are noted, many of these mines are also improvised and are mass-produced and standardized by Houthi forces. Some of the weapons employed by the Houthis have basic printed instructions, which suggests that they have been issued to low-skilled users, which further corroborates some of the allegations about child soldiers, that these weapons are being issued to young and inexperienced fighters. A number of the IED components that are used in the construction of IEDs originate in Iran. And some of the components also have markings that have been obliterated or removed, which is a method used to obscure the provenance or the origin of these items to make my job more difficult. So beginning with conventional mines, conventional is just another way of saying industrial produced by government mines. The Houthis have emplaced mainly 2 types of mines, well actually 3 types, but I'm only going to discuss 2. Those are anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines. In addition, you may have also heard about the water mines that they've put in the seas to try to disrupt shipping. The conventional mines are mainly left over from the regime, produced during the 1960s and 1970s, and were looted from government stockpiles during and following state collapse. The Houthis use these mines, as some are noted, along motorways and in civilian areas, so are a huge hazard for civilian communities. In addition to planting them as normal mines, they've also used them as main charges for IEDs. Next slide. So with regard to improvised mines, we've identified 3 different types of improvised mines that the Houthis mass produce. The first one is very similar to a Chinese mine called the type GLD 150A, directional mine. These are often emplaced on the side of the road and then are remotely detonated by someone once a vehicle, or a person for that matter, is passing by. In the photo, you can see the comparison. On the right side is the Chinese version, and on the left is the Houthi copy. Next slide. The second type is a mine that is modeled after an Iranian M18A2 directional mine, somewhat similar to the first Chinese mine, and functions in a very similar way. Next slide. And the third one, these are very common anti-vehicle mines, the TM46 and TM57. These are mainly former Soviet produced, but the Houthis have reverse engineered this one. And as you can see on the side of the mine are numbers which illustrate that these are produced in mass quantities and are serialized. Next slide. In addition to mines, the Houthis manufacture IEDs. The most common IED that we've documented in western Yemen are these IEDs, remote-controlled IEDs camouflaged as rocks. These are mass-produced, and they incorporate a passive infrared sensor. You can't see it in the photo, but there's actually a hole in the rock, the top left photo, that senses when a person or vehicle moves by, the IED automatically detonates and blasts the object. The internal components of these mines, we've been able to trace many of them to Iran through our tracing mechanism. In addition, several of the components in these mines were also used in IEDs that the Bahrainis captured from Shia militias that had been backed by Iran in Bahrain. Lastly, there was a ship called the Jihan 1 that was intercepted off the coast of Yemen back in 2013 that originated in Iran, and many of the components that we found in these rocks were also found and documented on this ship, the Jihan 1, again pointing to Iran as an origin for these items. Again, some of the components within these IEDs had markings that were obliterated, which make them effectively impossible to trace. The other type of IED that is very common across Yemen are victim-operated IEDs, which are triggered by these pressure plates, which is in the photo on the screen. These are also mass-produced. There are two types of pressure plates. One is person-operated, which are very thin. The other one is vehicle-operated, which tend to be thicker and are placed under the road for vehicles to drive over. Most importantly, these pressure plates have labels with instructions explaining how to use them, and they also comprise lot and serial numbers, which suggests that they are mass-produced and distributed to low-skilled users, as I noted previously. Next slide. So just some concluding remarks, hopefully to trigger some conversation. Landmine contamination in Yemen will have humanitarian consequences, not just now, but for generations to come. As you all know, these are hidden from view and take decades to remove. The Yemeni Executive Mine Action Center between 2016 and 2018 claimed that the army removed 300,000 landmines that the Houthis had laid. Now, we were not able to independently verify that, but I can say during our deployments that we've witnessed thousands and thousands of landmines that have been pulled out from the ground and also out of workshops and Houthi strongholds. So the problem is severe. There should be further investment and planning in mine clearance operations. Of course, some of this is premature because there is still a conflict ongoing, but it is not too early to begin planning on how to clear the areas and who will be involved in those efforts. All of these efforts should be coordinated with the Yemen Executive Mine Action Center. And I think even though there is any representation among the Houthis here today, the Houthis need to be engaged on compliance with the Mine Ban Treaty. There is an organization called Geneva Call that works with non-state actors to get them to comply with international standards, and they have been effective. So it should be another avenue for dealing with this issue. Lastly, the international community should exert pressure on companies whose components are being used in the construction of IEDs so that they can enact greater due diligence and also know your customer initiatives. So with that, I will leave it there and open to any questions that you all may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonah. This is informative, scary, and really not a short of a genocide created by the Iranian regime. And I'm really disappointed that our mission, the Yemeni mission, have not filed an official complaint, Iran getting involved in our affair. This conclude this conference, but before we do that, I'm going to leave the audience to ask the panel questions. So feel free to ask a question to any of the panelists.
About the mines, as you know, they are the most danger for the whole country in the future, because war could stop. But even when you stop the war and parties to fight, they will stay there. And from my military history, I know I used to work for 10 years in Saada. And in the 19, at that time, I know some of the military leaders give the headquarters and the capital Sana'a advice, those, especially the tanks mines, supposed to move out of the cities. So they took them from many cities to Saada at that time. And they put them in very historical fort, I mean, we call it Gal'a. And yeah, master of fort, like, I don't know. In English, what's the best name of it? But they put it, if somebody heard about As-Sinara, Gal'at As-Sinara, many of them there. That's in the 19th, to be away of people on the cities. We didn't know what's coming on, that the war will start in Saada. My recommendation, we should have plan, big plan, not small plan. Whenever the war stop, we should start right away to be aware of this future big danger problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Any further questions? Maybe I'll ask Jonah a question. Has the ICC been involved in getting these people, supplying the mines to these region, some kind of responsibilities or warning or any kind of criminal indication?
Yeah, as far as I know, there haven't been any cases brought to the ICC. I think that's probably a very lengthy process and requires some consensus. But I think Peter mentioned the UN panel of experts, which is the Security Council mandated group, has done several years of investigation and has identified some of the drivers of the conflict and has made recommendations to the Security Council. Of course, again, within the Security Council, consensus is also a limiting factor. So there aren't too many teeth, so to speak, that we have to sink into this issue, unfortunately.
Dr. Dahan?
In Yemen existing for many years. As you know, the conflicts in the past decades, a lot of land mines were in the different areas of Yemen, and the United Nations was taking care of that. So many programs were created to clean up the ground from land mines in different areas. But the biggest amount of land mines, it's never been on the ground like the last conflict, where the amount of individual and other kinds or categories of land mines were planted in neighborhoods, in the agricultural areas, and the public roads, everywhere. Now the Yemeni land is affected and needs many years to clean up the ground from the land mines that they were planted in the last 4 years. So I think there was a report, I don't remember exactly which agency issued that report, that tells the amount of land mines in Yemen is the biggest number after the World War II. So this is a very serious problem. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor again. I would like, first of all, to thank the speakers for their presentations. It is terrific. I mean, we are in the government of Yemen fully aware of this problem, and it is another concern of the Yemeni government, and it is on our priorities that we address this issue. I mean, also responding to your comment, we have been addressing the issue for several years now. And one of the problems, I mean, it is problematic that it is millions, I mean, of landmines and IEDs planted by the Houthis. But the other main concern is that these plantation goes without maps. This is another issue to be addressed as well. Regarding Iran, I mean, we have been addressing the involvement of Iran and supporting to the Houthis for several years. In different occasions, we have been sending letters to the UN Security Council. It is not that the Yemeni government says that. It's not also the Yemeni NGOs that document all these violations and crimes against Yemenis and the humanity. It's also the panel of experts of the UN Security Council on Yemen who reported and documented these violations in their reports. In particular, their 2017 report that Iran is violating the UN Security Council 2216, 2231, and what we need now is that the international community apply more pressure on Iran to stop meddling in the Yemeni affairs and stop supporting the Houthis by all means. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In conclusion, I guess the closing remarks, I want you to think if Yemen was 100 people, 80 needs aid to survive, 60 have barely anything to eat, 58 have no access to clean water, 52 have no access to health care. However, Yemen is not 100 people. Yemen is 27 million people. Thank you.